Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. We're on Season 19, Killer Pairs, where we're going to cover people who work together to murder. It could be family members, people involved in relationships, or just a couple of friends out doing some murdering. If you're entertained by these videos, hit like, subscribe, or leave me a comment. You can also check out my other channel, Somewhere Sinister, that's a little more history related. There's links in the description. When a man is found lying dead in an alley in Los Angeles, California, it was initially believed to be a hit and run. As detectives assessed the scene, it didn't take long for things to not add up. The victim didn't have injuries that would indicate he was struck by a car. He had no ID on him and was sent to the coroner as a John Doe. When investigators finally learned his name, they discovered that he had been homeless and that two women had taken a large amount of insurance out on him. That was strange enough, but they eventually learned that it wasn't the first time that had happened. This is Monsters. Helen Golay was born on February 3, 1931 in East Linn County, Texas. Her life was immediately thrown into chaos. Shortly after her birth, her mother left her father and started a family with another man. Then her father died in a car accident and she went to live with her maternal grandfather, but he died not long after. From there, she was sent to live with family in the small town of Hoquiam near the Pacific coast of Washington state. After a few years, Helen was placed into the foster system. It's said that, despite all the turmoil, she did well living in Hoquiam. She excelled academically and was on the honor roll. After she graduated from high school, Helen moved to Oakland, California, and eventually met a young naval aviator named Vernon Golay. The couple got married in 1951, and Vernon used his GI Bill to become a dentist. The couple relocated to Salem, Oregon, and had two daughters, Pamela and Lisa. Vernon and Helen divorced in 1960, and a few years later, Helen was pregnant again. Not much is known about the father of her third child, Keisha, but Helen gave her the last name Golay, something that Vernon was not happy about. He would say in a later interview, quote, "Let me make one thing perfectly clear. Keisha may have been raised by Helen using the name Golay, but she is definitely not my daughter. She is not a Golay, and Helen knew that." Vernon made it clear that after divorcing Helen, he paid her $400 in child support for Pam and Lisa, but never a dime for Keisha. Helen took her daughters and returned to California, where she married a man named David Wells in 1970, but the marriage only lasted a year. After her divorce from David, she moved to West Los Angeles and began working for a real estate mogul named Artie Aaron. She learned the business from him, but it wasn't until he died in 1999 that she really started living the high life, though that wasn't through hard work. After Artie died, Helen used a power of attorney to take possession of his real estate holdings. Those included houses, apartment buildings, and parcels of land. She ended up cheating Artie's own daughter out of properties by using the power of attorney to leave his properties to herself. Her acquisition of Artie's properties immediately made her a landlady, and the people who rented from her said she was mean-spirited. She would call and report her own tenants for minor parking violations, and once painted the entire curb around one property red so the tenant couldn't park near the house. Helen had amassed quite a bit of money from her frauds, driving a Mercedes and living in a $1.5 million house, but she liked people to believe that she was poor. She would take her boyfriend, who was also her daughter's ex-boyfriend, to a restaurant and order one meal. Then the couple would split it and complain that the portions weren't big enough. Despite being considered overly frugal, she did pay for her youngest daughter, Keisha, to get breast enhancement surgery. That was around the same time she had set her daughter up with Gary Hilliel, but when Keisha lost interest in him, Helen started dating him. Image was a big deal to Helen, so she had a membership to a fitness club in West Los Angeles. That was where she met a woman named Olga who would become her partner in crime. Despite their different backgrounds, they found common ground in their shared experiences of hardship and their struggle to achieve financial stability. Olga Rutterschmidt was born on March 5, 1933 in Budapest, Hungary. After World War II broke out, she spent most of her time hiding in the basement of the apartment building she lived in with her parents. Olga played piano, and one day, despite being told not to go upstairs, she went to play her piano. It was then that her building was bombed and Olga severely injured her right hand. Fortunately, the injury didn't stop her from playing and she became a very talented pianist. Those early years were traumatizing as she watched hundreds of Jews be rounded up every day and sent off to concentration camps or even be shot in the street right in front of her. When the war was over, the trauma caused Olga, who was a teen at the time, severe mental health issues. She was eventually hospitalized and given a series of electroshock treatments. After she was released, her mother wanted to stay in Hungary, but Olga did not, so she walked to another country. The exact details have never been released. From there, she was sponsored by a family in New York and traveled to the United States in 1957. Olga eventually moved to Los Angeles, where she met and married Golay Rutterschmidt in 1975. The Rutterschmidts owned a coffee shop in Hollywood, but Golay took off in 1978. It's unknown where Golay went, but it's believed he died in Hungary in 2005. After that, Olga struggled to get by, regularly utilizing public assistance programs. Olga became the yin to Helen's yang. Olga was described as being explosive, loud, and hard to deal with in public. She became the muscle of the pair, while Helen did the investing, planning, and scheming. Neither woman was known for making friends easily, yet they formed a bond that would prove to be as enduring as it was destructive. They began frequenting West Side gyms, the Beverly Hills Hotel, and the Hollywood Roosevelt together, cutting striking figures with their distinct styles. Helen was known for her short skirts and towering bouffants, while Olga's Hungarian accent added an air of exotic intrigue to their presence. As their friendship deepened, so did their shared obsession with making quick money. Both women had experienced financial difficulties and failed marriages, which fueled their desire for financial security by any means necessary. That mutual interest in easy money became the foundation of their partnership and the driving force behind their increasingly nefarious schemes. Their initial forays into illicit activities were relatively small-scale. They allegedly began stealing purses and credit cards from unsuspecting gym and hotel patrons. Olga reportedly boasted about her ability to pyramid credit cards, using one to pay off another before defaulting on the issuers. Helen, meanwhile, engaged in questionable real estate transactions and pursued a string of lawsuits against anyone who stood in her way. As time went on, their schemes grew bolder and more complex. They began targeting wealthy men at upscale hotels, posing as guests and using their charm to secure expensive dinners and gifts. In some cases, the encounters reportedly escalated to outright robbery. On June 21, 2005, a body was discovered in an alley behind a Bristol Farms in the Westwood area of Los Angeles. The body was soon identified as being a 50-year-old man named Kenneth McDavid. The scene initially appeared to be a hit-and-run accident, but several suspicious elements caught the attention of investigators. Kenneth's chest and skull had been crushed, which was highly unusual for a typical hit-and-run victim. Additionally, his clothes were smeared with grease from the undercarriage of the automobile, suggesting he had been lying down when he was run over. Nearby, a bicycle was found with its front tire removed, as though Kenneth had been repairing it. Detective Nelson Hernandez questioned why anyone would stop in a dark alley to repair their bicycle when they could easily walk to a better-lit street nearby. Further investigation revealed that there was no damage to the tire and it wasn't flat. The placement of Kenneth's helmet on top of the undamaged tire further raised suspicions about the authenticity of the scene. Soon the body was removed from the scene and the detective went to the address listed on Kenneth's ID card. At the address, the manager led them to apartment 410, a studio apartment with a small living area, a kitchen, and a bathroom. The manager explained that Kenneth had been homeless, but a woman named Helen Golay had rented the apartment for him in September of 2002. Helen had paid the $900 rent every month with a check. Then, in late 2004, Kenneth started letting a bunch of other people live there, and in December, Helen kicked them all out and changed the locks. That was the last time the manager had seen Kenneth. As the investigation unfolded, several red flags emerged that pointed to foul play rather than a tragic accident. Toxicology tests revealed high levels of alcohol, zolpidem, and hydrocodone in Kenneth's system, enough to render him unconscious and make it impossible for him to have been riding a bicycle at the time of his death. Investigators found a surveillance camera that covered the alley, but the picture was so out of focus that in the dark, all they could make out were taillights. They could see one car drive through the alley that evening, but it went through so quickly that it was clear it hadn't hit anything. The next vehicle in the video stopped and was there for about 5 minutes before turning back on and taking off. Then another vehicle pulled into the alley. The reverse lights came on as the car backed up. Then it went back into drive and took off. Based on the information the detectives had, it still looked like a hit and run, but the driver knew that they had hit someone and fled the scene. It wasn't until about 3 months later that detectives got a call with some pretty damning information. Mutual of New York had opened an investigation into claims made on 2 policies totaling $1 million, with Helen Golay and Olga Rutterschmidt listed as beneficiaries. The inconsistencies in their relationship to Kenneth, alternating between business partners, fiancé, and cousin, raised immediate suspicions. In some documents, Kenneth was listed as the women's business partner. They had basically described him as the brains behind their operation and that, if he died, it would leave them ruined. In some places, he was listed as Helen's fiancé, and in other documents, he was listed as Olga's cousin. It definitely gave the investigators reason to suspect foul play. That's when Detective Dennis Kilcoyne noticed a striking similarity to another case that he had worked years earlier. When he grabbed the case file, he and Detective Hernandez started crossing off the similarities, including them both involving Helen Golay, Olga Rutterschmidt, hit and run, and insurance policies. In 1997, Helen and Olga began volunteering at the Hollywood Presbyterian Church's Program for the Homeless. That seemingly charitable act masked their true intentions. The 2 elderly women saw an opportunity to profit from the misfortune of others. Their strategy involved identifying vulnerable homeless men who could be easily manipulated. Those individuals, often struggling with poverty and isolation, became the perfect targets for Helen and Olga's deadly scheme. The women's age and appearance as kindly grandmother types helped them gain the trust of their unsuspecting victims. The 2 women met Paul Vados, a 73-year-old Hungarian immigrant, in 1997. Helen told Paul that she wanted to help him get back on his feet and offered to put him up in an apartment and pay his bills. The women spent the next 2 years taking out life insurance policies on Paul, adding up to hundreds of thousands of dollars. 2 years is an important time frame, especially in the world of life insurance. When a life insurance policy is taken out on someone, there can be a number of restrictions on whether or not you can collect on the policy. It's a period of time that allows the insurance company to contest the payout as a means of avoiding fraud. After 2 years, the contestability of the policy becomes very hard. A life insurance company is usually required to pay out a policy after it's been in place for 2 years no matter what, even in the event of suicide. So Helen and Olga took out insurance policies and waited for the contestability period to end, and then they set in motion the events that would allow them to collect on the policy. In the early morning hours of November 8, 1999, Paul Vados' body was discovered in an alley off La Brea Avenue in Hollywood. He was laying right in the middle of the alley. Paul didn't look like a transient as he was groomed and had on clean clothes. The only other thing out of place was that he had grease on his hands. There was no identification on the body, and the only other item in the alley was a baseball cap, which was never confirmed to be related to the case. A canvass of the area didn't turn up anyone who recognized him, and he was sent to the coroner as a John Doe. A toxicology report showed that he had nothing in his system and was not intoxicated. He also had no injuries to his lower legs, which was common when a person is struck by a vehicle. It just seemed like he had laid down in the middle of the alley and was eventually run over. It didn't make sense. The authorities identified the body with fingerprints, but it was 9 days before anyone came forward claiming to know Paul. On November 17th, Helen and Olga filed a missing persons report for Paul. It turned out that the women had picked up Paul and drove into an alley, likely claiming that there was something wrong with the car. Once Paul had climbed underneath to troubleshoot, they ran him over and then stripped him of ID. They thought they could just go to the insurance companies and get the life insurance payments by simply telling them Paul was dead. Of course, the insurance company needs proof of that in the form of a death certificate, so the women adjusted their plans and reported Paul missing, claiming that he was Olga's cousin. Sound familiar? It wasn't long before Helen called the detective investigating the death and asked for a copy of the accident report. The problem was that the authorities were only able to provide a copy of the report to a family member. 2 days later, Olga, Paul's supposed cousin, marched into the police department, got a copy of the report, and walked out. She didn't ask any questions about her cousin and didn't look at the report. After that, the case of Paul Vados went cold. Not long after killing Paul, Helen and Olga met Kenneth McDavid and offered to help him out. Over the years, they took out multiple life insurance policies totaling over $5 million. On June 21, 2005, they drugged Kenneth and brought him to the alley. They pulled his body out of the car and then ran over him. Then they contacted the insurance company and requested their payout. But one of the policies wasn't quite 2 years old by then. It was 46 days away from the 2-year mark, so Mutual of New York looked at the policy to see if they had any reason to contest it. That's when some of the information on the policy raised a few red flags. The policy listed Kenneth's employer as NKO Associates, with an address at 1776 North Sycamore, and listed his annual salary as being $65,000 a year. When the agent in charge of the policy called the Social Security office to get a report of Kenneth's yearly income, it wasn't even close to $65,000. In 2003, Kenneth had a total income of $42. The insurance agent traveled to Los Angeles and tried to meet with both Helen and Olga, but had no luck. He met with the coroner and visited the scene before returning to New York. Then he spent the next week trying to get a hold of either of the women, but they refused to talk to him. During that time, it became known that Helen and Olga had been involved in the death of Paul Vados and had received insurance payouts in that case. Eventually, the agent returned to Los Angeles and finally met with Helen, but it was only to give her a letter explaining that the company was rescinding the policies and giving her a check to refund her for all of the premiums she had paid. Of course, Helen was outraged and threw the letter back before storming out of the restaurant where the meeting had taken place. In the meantime, the Los Angeles police had made Helen and Olga the prime suspects in the murders of both Kenneth McDavid and Paul Vados. Detectives had tracked down Paul's daughter Stella, who lived just north of Sacramento. She told the investigators that she had tried to track her father down in recent years, but wasn't able to find him. When she was told that Helen was supposedly his fiancée and that Olga claimed to be his cousin, she said she had never heard of them. Stella informed the investigators that her father had worked for Apple Computers and was an alcoholic. Her mother had died in the early 80s, and it might have triggered Paul to fall into a depression. Detectives tracked down Kenneth's brother, Robert, who was living in a group home in Sacramento. He was able to give them the address of their sister, who Robert hadn't spoken to in 5 or 6 years, despite only living 2 miles or 3.2 kilometers away. Unsurprisingly, Kenneth's siblings didn't know who Helen and Olga were either. Then the detectives started digging into Helen and Olga's past, trying to find a connection to any other deaths. First, they looked into the death of a 97-year-old man named Fred Downey. On November 18, 2000, about a year after Paul Vados' death, he was hit by a car while crossing the street near Helen's home and had been living in an apartment in a building owned by Helen. Oh, and he was dating her youngest daughter, Keisha. That's right, at 97, Fred was the boyfriend of Keisha, who was only in her late 30s at the time. Fred was a widower from Massachusetts who had owned a private kindergarten in West Harwich. His wife had died in 1978, and after retiring, Fred was introduced to Keisha when she was in town visiting her half-sister Pam. Fred was immediately smitten with Keisha, and it wasn't long before she was able to convince him to pack up and move to Los Angeles. At the same time, Keisha transferred the title of his home to herself for $1 and became the executor of his estate. She then sold the house for $200,000 and took control of his assets. At first, Fred wrote back home about how happy he was and how much he loved California, but after a few months, his letters revealed that he thought he had made a mistake and he wanted to return home. Soon after, he was killed in a hit-and-run accident. The problem with the incident was that Fred was struck by a Honda Civic being driven by a woman named Cheryl Clark. He was determined that Cheryl had no connection to Helen and Olga, and the accident investigation determined that she was not at fault. Investigators believed that Fred was somehow given a signal that the street was clear to cross, but since his eyesight was so poor, he couldn't see the oncoming vehicle. The street he was crossing did not have a crosswalk. He survived in the hospital for a month before finally succumbing to his injuries. At that point, all of his assets went to Keisha, and his family never received any part of them. Despite suspicions, there's no evidence that proves that Helen, Olga, or Keisha were involved in his death. It's also been said that Artie Aaron's death was suspicious and, like the other deaths around Helen, it conveniently benefited her. Again, there's no evidence that proves she was involved, and some people have said that Artie had died of cancer. While some detectives were digging into the suspected murderers' pasts, they were also under full-time surveillance. Officers watched Olga pick up a 75-year-old man named Joseph Gabor and drove him to a Washington Mutual bank and helped him with some banking errands. Joseph was mostly blind and had known Olga for many years, so he was pretty comfortable with her assisting him with sensitive matters. After she returned Joseph to his home, Olga was followed to a FedEx Kinko's where she went inside and used one of their pay computers. She was having trouble with what she was doing, so she turned to the man next to her and asked for help. Not knowing that he was an undercover officer, she didn't try to hide the fact that she was attempting to apply for a platinum credit card through HSBC Bank under the name Carol Vane. She had listed Joseph's address on the application and provided a social security number that was not hers. Authorities contacted Joseph and warned him that they believed he was Helga and Olga's next target. Then the detectives learned that Helen, using the name Olga Schmidt, had purchased rubber stamps with the signatures of dozens of men, including Kenneth McDavid. Investigators believed they were going to use the stamps to start taking out life insurance policies on the men, scaling their operation up to an unimaginable level. All of the men were transients who fit the perfect mold for who Helen and Olga liked to target. They started the arduous task of seeking out all of the men and decided it was finally time to put an end to Helen and Olga's reign of terror. They didn't have enough evidence to arrest them for murder, but they were able to arrest them for federal mail fraud charges. Both Helen Golay and Olga Rutterschmidt were arrested by federal authorities on May 18, 2006. At Helen's house, investigators found documents pertaining to a 1999 Mercury Sable, and inside her Mercedes SUV, they found a movie ticket stub dated November 8, 1999, the day before Paul Vados was found dead. It was for a 10:45 showing of the crime thriller The Bone Collector starring Denzel Washington and Angelina Jolie. The ticket stub was attached to a post-it note that had Paul's name, date of birth, and social security number on it. It's theorized that Paul was taken to the movies and either on the way there or the way back they stopped claiming car trouble, which led Paul to climb under the vehicle. There were also prescription medications in Helen's house, and 2 of them matched the drugs found in Kenneth's system after his death. His toxicology report listed 3 chemicals: ethanol, zolpidem, and hydrocodone. Ethanol is just alcohol, but zolpidem is found in Ambien and the hydrocodone is found in Vicodin. It's believed that the women gave alcohol and prescription drugs to Kenneth and transported him to the alley after he passed out. Another thing that caught Detective Kilcoyne's attention were some of the books in Helen's house. There was an open book in the living room, looking like Helen had just been reading it when they arrived at the house. That book was The Sociopath Next Door by Harvard psychologist Martha Stout. In her bedroom, they found a copy of a book called The Modern Identity Changer: How to Create and Use a New Identity for Privacy and Personal Freedom by Sheldon Charrett. At Olga's house, they found that the woman made notes on everything. Notebooks, scraps of paper, anything she could write on. It wasn't a diary, they were mostly calculations of how much she owed on various insurance policies. They also found a letter that Olga had written to Helen that said, quote, "Dear Helen, I have a few very interesting and good life insurance company listings. They pay regardless of illness or accidental cause. No hassle, no investigations." Then there were all the printouts that explained how to beat traffic tickets, descriptions of pyramid and Ponzi schemes, and how to rip off insurance companies. She had notes with lists of people's names with their social securities and newspaper clippings with stories of unusual ways people had died. Within all the papers, investigators found Kenneth McDavid's original death certificate. The arrest on mail fraud charges was only to get the women off the street while the LAPD built a murder case against them. While they were in a holding area awaiting arraignment, they were unknowingly being recorded. Helen stayed relatively quiet, but Olga did not. She was upset about the charges and she wanted Helen to know. She told Helen that their situation was her fault because she was greedy. Having so many insurance policies was a bad idea. When they were eventually interviewed, Olga told them that the insurance policies were all in Helen's name and not hers, trying to distance herself from the crime. With the women locked up in a federal facility, the investigators went into overdrive. One of the reasons this type of insurance fraud is possible is because insurance companies don't check with each other. They have no idea if you have other life insurance policies with other companies. It turned out that the women had life insurance policies for Kenneth with Transamerica, Mutual of New York, First Penn Pacific, Empire General, North American, AAA Life, Garden State, Mutual of Omaha, Global Life, United Investors, Great West, New York Life, American Life, John Hancock, Interstate Assurance, Guaranteed Trust, Monumental Life, CNA Continental, American Bankers, and Guaranteed Reserve. Holy shit. It added up to $5,700,090 in payouts. It seemed that the ladies wanted to maximize their efforts on Kenneth's murder since Paul's life insurance policies had only added up to $879,500 in payouts. While the investigators were requesting information about Kenneth and Paul from various insurance companies, AAA Life informed them that they had recently gotten an application for insurance on a man named Jimmy Lee Covington, who detectives were able to track down and interview. Despite going into hiding directly after being informed that he was a target of two black widows interested in carrying out an insurance scam, he eventually agreed to testify against the women. Investigators also found a post-it note amongst Helen's personal effects that had information about a 1999 Mercury Sable belonging to a woman named Hillary Adler. When detectives interviewed Hillary, she said she had never owned a vehicle matching that description, but she had been the victim of identity theft after her purse was stolen from an athletic club in April of 2003. Coincidentally, both Helen and Keisha were members of the same club. The vehicle was in the system as having been cited for being illegally parked in an alley behind Helen's house. A few weeks later, the vehicle was finally found parked in Hollywood less than a mile from Olga's house. Records showed that the vehicle had been sold to Olga in 2004, but it was registered in Hillary Adler's name. Once the investigators got the vehicle back to the garage, it wasn't long before they found blood on the undercarriage. A DNA test revealed that the blood belonged to Kenneth McDavid. Helen and Olga were each charged with 4 counts of murder on July 31, 2006. 2 counts of first-degree murder with a special circumstance of murder for financial gain, which made them eligible for the death penalty. They were also charged with 2 counts of conspiracy to commit murder for financial gain. Federal fraud charges were dismissed and the women were released from federal custody and immediately rearrested for the murders. They were transferred to the women's prison in Linwood, California, where they spent the next 2 years making life extremely difficult for the prison staff. Olga made complaints about everything: food, television access, clothing, showering, recreation. The guards would regularly put her in solitary confinement in order to shut her up for a few days. Helen also complained about her living situation. Being used to the finer things in life, paid for by committing crimes, she was not happy about having to make do. She complained that her shoes were too worn out and that her clothes weren't warm enough. During court hearings, she requested special treatment to be transported back to prison immediately after her hearing concluded instead of waiting with the rest of the prisoners for the end of the day. Her reasoning was that she simply didn't want to return to her cell that late. The judge denied her request. The trial began on March 11, 2008 for the charges that Helen and Olga had both pleaded not guilty to, maintaining that they had not killed anyone and they were just casual friends. The prosecutor opened by explaining the murders of Paul Vados and Kenneth McDavid had been a plan to get money by using two men who had nothing themselves. But their plan didn't end there because they had evidence that the women had already started the process with a third victim, Jimmy Covington. They had already taken out multiple insurance policies on him and, like the other two victims, claiming to be Jimmy's fiancé and cousin, made themselves the beneficiaries. From there, the prosecution presented their evidence. The biggest piece of evidence was the silver 1999 Mercury Sable. When the vehicle was examined, Kenneth's blood was found on the undercarriage. That proved that he had been run over by that specific vehicle, but how was it connected to Helen and Olga? Well, the vehicle was registered in the name of Hillary Adler, who had never owned the vehicle. She had had her purse stolen from an athletic club that Helen had also belonged to. Then, the car salesman testified that Olga had purchased the car from him in January of 2004. One of Helen's neighbors testified that she had seen the Mercury parked behind Helen's house for more than a year. Another detail that was discovered when the car was examined by investigators was that the fuel line had been broken, likely having gotten caught on Kenneth's body as they ran him over. A tow truck driver testified about being called out to the gas station at the end of the alley where Kenneth was killed to tow a 1999 Mercury Sable. The call was registered to a AAA account belonging to Helen Golay, and he towed the vehicle to her house. Jimmy Covington's testimony was possibly the most damning of the trial. He described living on the streets in Hollywood and going to the Hollywood Presbyterian Church on Sundays for dinner. He explained that in 2005 he had been approached by a woman who ended up being Olga. She told him that she worked with the homeless to help them get back on their feet. She offered to give him a temporary place to sleep that night, and then they could fill out some paperwork the next day to get him an apartment and some benefits. She took him to a building that had an office on the second floor. Inside was a desk and a computer, and in the back room was a futon that he slept on that night. She eventually brought him forms where he filled in his name, date of birth, medical history, and social security number. All information that someone would need to commit identity theft, but also information that would be needed to apply for most types of social benefits. Eventually, Jimmy got suspicious of some of the personal information Olga was asking for and started declining to answer her questions. That was when she started getting aggressive about him filling out the form, and he finally left. He had slept in the office for 7 nights and was given $15 by the time he backed out of the offer. But it seemed that Olga had gotten enough information because Helen had opened multiple life insurance policies. During the trial, hints that the two women were not entirely getting along came to light. An insurance agent for AAA Life claimed that a woman with an accent who said her name was Olga had called and she wanted to report a fraud. Now, she wasn't having a change of heart regarding her deadly scams. She told the agent that she was Kenneth's fiancée, not Helen. She angrily explained that her partner was trying to screw her out of money by changing the beneficiary to herself. In the end, Helen was the one that would receive the payout after Kenneth's death. The prosecutor also showed the video that was recorded while the women were in holding after their federal arrest. It showed Olga berating Helen for getting greedy and taking out too many policies, and Helen continually telling Olga to be quiet. Helen even said stuff like, quote, "He asked us to take out those policies, don't you remember?" A painful attempt to protect herself from what would eventually come. When Helen's lawyer started his defense, it became clear that there was no loyalty anywhere in either of the women's lives. The defense attorney went on to put on what's called a third-party culpability defense. He asserted that it was actually Keisha Golay who had killed Kenneth McDavid and framed her mother for the crime. He claimed that Keisha had an extreme hatred of her mother, and that's why she had framed her for murder. He said it was Keisha who had stolen Hillary Adler's purse and used the Mercury Sable to run over Kenneth. She better fit the description of who the tow truck driver had picked up when he towed that car back to Helen's house. According to the defense, Helen had no idea that Kenneth was a target, but that was hard to believe. She received substantial payouts from multiple life insurance policies that she had taken out and lied on. The video of the women in the holding cell was also proof that Helen had some knowledge of what was going on. All the defense proved was that Keisha was also likely involved in the crimes. Yes, Helen and Keisha had a tumultuous relationship, having even sued each other at various points, but that wasn't going to stop them from working together to make millions of dollars at the expense of other people's lives. Most of Helen's lawyer's arguments were thrown out by the judge for various reasons. Olga's lawyer didn't call any witnesses. There was a lot less discussion about Paul Vados as there wasn't any direct evidence. The vehicle that killed Kenneth was linked to Helen and Olga, but there wasn't anything like that in Paul's case outside of the insurance policies. The two murders were linked by the fact that they were identical and the women got insurance payouts after both deaths. It took the jury quite some time, but they eventually found Helen Golay guilty of all charges and Olga Rutterschmidt guilty of first-degree murder of only Paul Vados and both conspiracy charges. At the sentencing hearing, it was made clear that Helen and Olga had killed two men simply because of greed. Helen was already well off when she put her plan to kill Paul into motion. At the time of her arrest, she had millions of dollars in the bank and was living in a $1.5 million home. Olga had over $800,000 in her bank account, some of which was likely from their first victim, but committing a second murder and planning a third were motivated entirely by greed. The victim impact statements made it clear that Helen and Olga believed that homeless men were not worthy of living. They were pieces of garbage that deserved to be thrown away to benefit themselves. The prosecutors had not sought the death penalty, so the women were both sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. They would both die in prison. Of course, appeals were filed and they were all denied. Both Helen and Olga were taken to the women's prison in Chowchilla, California, where they remain today. Both women wanted money without working for it so they could live their lives in the lap of luxury, but instead, they're living their lives like monsters in cages. If you're a fan of true crime, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss an episode. You can also hit like or leave us a comment. You can check out our other show, Somewhere Sinister, on YouTube or anywhere that you listen to podcasts. If you'd like to support the show, check out our merchandise at thisismonsters.com. The link is in the description. Thanks again, and be safe.